then I would need to stop the transcription before I start. I want to find out if my voice is audible enough. So, can you guys hear me? Am I audible enough?
Yes, please. Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, good. So, welcome to the second half of the semester. The first half was a preparation for the second. So in the first half, we studied concepts in language and meaning. We studied statements that are not logical. We learned to identify passages that are argumentative or not. So now it's time to study arguments. Now, arguments are also called reasoning or syllogisms. So the three terms are used interchangeably. Now, two major categories of reasoning, we have deductive and inductive. We also have causal reasoning, but it's a form of inductive reasoning. Now let's begin with deductive reasoning, also called deductive argument or deductive syllogism. This is reasoning in which the relationship between the premises and the conclusion is a logical relationship. The relationship between the premises and the conclusion is a logical relationship. So as a result of this, it is reasoning that permits only one conclusion. So only one conclusion is possible from a valid deductive argument. Deductive arguments are just like mathematics. If you add 2 and 2, you can only get 4. You can't get any other number. Now, example of a deductive argument. All men are mortal. Kofi is a man, therefore Kofi is mortal. Now, so when you look at this argument, you cannot change or modify the conclusion. For example, you can't say Kofi is immortal or a fire cabinet is mortal. Those things are not possible. So only one conclusion is logical, and that is Kofi is mortal. And that's because we said all men are mortal, and then we said Kofi is a man. Okay. Now, before we begin to look at deductive arguments, let's look at let's look at the distinction between two parts of a sentence. Now, that part of the sentence that we normally call the subject. In arguments, we call it the reference class. The reference class. And that part we call the predicate. We normally call it the attribute class. The attribute class. For example, all men are mortal. All men is the reference class. Are mortal is the attribute class. Now, the reference class is that to which the sentence refers. That to which the sentence refers is the reference class. And the sentence refers to all men, whilst the attribute class is that part of the sentence that is attributing something to or something about the reference class. Now, so the rest of the sentence is attributing something to all men. So we have both reference and attribute classes, which are analogous to subject and predicate in English grammar. Then we have also a distinction between different types of reference classes. A reference class can be finite or infinite. It can be finite or infinite. Infinite reference class refers to all members or no members of a class, either 100% or 0%. All members or no members of a class, either 100% or 0%. That's what we call infinite reference class. For example, all men, no man, any man. These are infinite reference classes. Infinite reference classes are normally classes of uncountable items. You cannot count the items in an infinite reference class. You can't count it. You cannot count all men. You can't count no man. You can't count any man. They are uncountable. That's why we call them infinite. Then the finite reference class refers to countable and particular members of a class, anything between 0 and 100%. For example, some men, 80% of men, 5% of men, all the men. All the men. Now, all the men is different from all men. Now, all men is uncountable, but all the men can be counted. For instance, all the men in this room, all the men in this class, all the men in this country, all the men in this world, they can be counted. So these are examples of the finite reference class. Some men, 80% of men, 5 men, all the men, few men, almost all the men, and so on. Now we have a distinction between universal and particular statements. Now, statements containing infinite reference class are called universal statements, while statements containing finite reference class are called particular statements. Infinite reference class. Their statements are universal statements, and then statements containing a finite reference class are particular statements. Example of universal statements: all men are water. Example of particular statements: some men drink alcohol. And now a little exercise before we move on. Which statements are universal and which are particular? This table is three-legged. This table is three-legged. Can someone tell me what Abdul is?
Yeah, this table is three-legged. Is particular.
Is it universal or particular?
Particular.
Tables can be sat on. Tables can be sat on. Is it particular or universal?
Universal.
Universal.
Yes.
James and Mary passed the examination.
It is particular.
Good. All visitors should be treated with respect.
It's universal.
So that's universal. Now, let's look at the subject of validity. Validity. An argument is valid if the premises make the conclusion necessary and the conclusion follows with certainty. An argument is valid if the premises make the conclusion necessary and the conclusion follows with certainty. All valid arguments are deductive arguments. So inductive arguments are strictly not valid. So deductive argument is a purely mathematical argument. The relationship between the premises and the conclusion is logical, So that's why we say a deductive argument that is correct is a valid argument. No other argument is valid. Now let's compare deductive to inductive. This is an example of an inductive argument. Premise 1, 95% of men are honest. 2, Peter is a man. Therefore, Peter is honest. Now, when you look at that. It doesn't say all men are honest. It just says 95% of men. And then Peter is a man, Peter is honest. Now, so how correct is the conclusion? Is the conclusion entirely correct? So you can say the conclusion is not entirely correct because we are not sure whether Peter is among the 95% of men that are honest or whether Peter is among the 5% that are not honest. So because you're not very sure, it means the conclusion is not, that's not the only conclusion that is possible. Another conclusion that is possible is that Peter is not honest. So more than one conclusion is possible. Possible conclusion one, Peter is honest. Possible conclusion two, Peter is not honest. So that's what makes it an inductive argument. That's how you know an inductive argument. An argument that gives rise to more than one possible conclusion is an inductive argument. Now let's look at the hidden conditional if and then. We normally say if this happened, then that will happen. If this, then that. If that, then this. If then. So if then is what we call a conditional statement. An if then statement is a conditional statement. Now, one of the ways of checking a deductive argument is to just convert the major premise to a conditional statement. Now, two ways of looking at arguments are the categorical and the conditional ways. All arguments have hidden conditionals. Now, let's look at this categorical statement. All men are mortal. Now, the conditional statement is, if something is a man, then it is mortal. If something is a man, then it is mortal. That's the conditional version of all men are mortal. So categorical statement, all men are mortal. Conditional version, if something is a man, then it is mortal. Now we have to learn to change the categorical statement to conditional statement. Now change the categorical statement of premise 1 to a conditional statement. Premise 1, if something is a mortal, then it is, if something is a man, then it is mortal. Peter is a man, therefore Peter is mortal. So when you change premise 1 to conditional statement, then it helps you to see the argument more clearly. Because a conditional in premise 1 will combine with premise 2 to show you clearly what the conclusion should be. If something is a man, then it's mortal. Peter is a man, therefore Peter is mortal. Now let's replace words with symbols. Now the categorical version of the argument, all men are mortal, all A's are B's. All men are mortal, all A's are B's. Peter is a man, X is an A. X is an A. Now remember that man or men is A. Man is A's, man is A. Peter is a man, X is an A, Peter is mortal, X is a B. So all A's are B's. X is an A, therefore X is a B. So when you convert the words to symbols, it helps you see the argument very clearly, very clearly, in a somewhat more graphical or mathematical way. Let's look at the conditional version. Premise 1, if something is a man, then it's mortal. Peter is a man, Peter is mortal. If A, then B. If A, then B. X is an A, therefore X is a B. X is an A, therefore X is a B. Or you can just say A, then therefore B. If A, then B. A, therefore B. So that's the conditional version. Now, having learned how to convert categorical to conditional statements, let's move on and see how to analyze deductive arguments. Now, there's this distinction between antecedents and consequents. There's a distinction between antecedents and consequents. Now, let's remember the difference between the reference class and the attribute class. We'll say the reference class is like the subject, the attribute class is like the predicate. Now, if we restate any categorical proposition as a conditional statement, the reference class becomes the antecedent and the attribute class becomes the consequent. If we restate any categorical proposition, any categorical statement into a conditional version, the reference class becomes the antecedent and the attribute class becomes the consequent. Example, all A are B. That's categorical. Or if A, then B. That's conditional. If A, then B. That's the conditional version. The reference class, in this case, A, is the antecedent. And then the attribute class, in this case, B, is the consequent. A is the antecedent and B is the consequent. So any statement referring to A will be either affirming or denying the antecedent. When you make another statement, that's when you make another statement that is referring to the A, it is either that statement is affirming the antecedent or denying the antecedent. And if you make any other statement referring to the B, then such a statement will be either affirming or denying the consequent. Statements referring to A are either affirming or denying the antecedent, and statements referring to B are either affirming or denying the consequent. So let's look at the example. X is an A. We had said all A's are B's. All A's are B's. Or if X is an A, then the X is a B. Now we're saying X is an A. That affirms the antecedent. X is not an A, denies the antecedent. X is a B, affirms the consequent. X is not a B, denies the consequent. Now let's look at an example of an argument that contains a statement that denies that affirms the antecedent. Now all A's are B's. X is an A, therefore X is a B. So you can see that the second premise is affirming the antecedent. The second premise is affirming the antecedent. Now, because the second premise is affirming the antecedent of the first premise, we say the entire argument is an argument that affirms the antecedent. Because the second premise is affirming the antecedent, we say the entire argument is an argument that affirms the antecedent. It is an argument that affirms the antecedent in order to reach its conclusion. Denying the antecedent. All A's are B's. X is not an A. X is not a B. So in this case, the second premise is denying the antecedent. And for that reason, we say the argument, the entire argument, is an argument that denies. So this is an argument that denies the antecedent. X is not an A, therefore X is not a B. We say the argument denies the antecedent in order to reach its conclusion. That's the route it is taking, or the channel it is taking. It is reaching its conclusion by denying the antecedent. Affirming the consequent. All A's are B's, X is a B, therefore X is an A. X is a B, therefore X is an A. So the second premise affirms the consequent. So this is an argument that reaches its conclusion through denying through affirming the consequent. It affirms, it's an argument that affirms the consequent in order to reach its conclusion. Denying the consequent. All A's are B's, X is not a B. Therefore, X is not an A. So this is an argument that denies the consequent in order to reach its conclusion. Now we've seen the four routes or channels the argument can take. Either reaching its conclusion by affirming the antecedent, or denying the antecedent, or affirming the consequent, or denying the consequent. So there are four ways an argument can reach its conclusion. Now, having seen those four ways, now we come to the rule for deductive reasoning. And the rule for deductive reasoning is that we only affirm the antecedent and deny the consequent in order to reach a valid conclusion. So out of the four operations, out of the four ways, so I think I am going to have to disable your microphones so that no one will be able to speak. When it's time for questioning, then I'll enable your microphones for you to ask questions. Out of the four ways an argument can reach its conclusions, only two of them can reach a valid conclusion. The first one is by affirming the antecedent, and the second one is by denying the consequent. Only two of these operations can lead to a valid conclusion. The other two, denying the antecedent and affirming the consequent, will lead you to a fallacy. It will lead you to an invalid conclusion. And we're going to see the reason why. Any argument that denies the antecedent or affirms the consequent will reach an invalid conclusion, and it will be an invalid argument. So we only affirm the antecedent and deny the consequent in order to reach a valid conclusion. Okay. Example, all A's are B's. X is an A, which affirms the antecedent. X is a B, which is a valid argument. So that is valid. All A's are B's. X is not an A, denies the antecedent. X is not a B. Now we have said that this is not a valid argument. Any argument that denies the antecedent will not be a valid argument. So let's convert it to words. All Ghanaians are Africans. Peter is a Ghanaian, which affirms the antecedent. Therefore, Peter is an African. And we say this is a valid argument. Now let's check the content of the argument. All Ghanaians are Africans. Yes, all Ghanaians are Africans. Peter is a Ghanaian. Yes. Therefore, Peter is an African. So because Peter is a Ghanaian, we conclude that Peter is an African. That's a valid argument. Now, so you can see that the argument is valid, because if all Ghanaians are Africans and Peter is a Ghanaian, then it follows that Peter is an African. Now let's look at the second one. All Ghanaians are Africans. Peter is not a Ghanaian, which denies the antecedent. Therefore, Peter is not an African. We said this is not a valid argument. Why is it not valid? Let's look at the argument again. All Ghanaians are Africans. Yes, every Ghanaian is an African. Peter is not a Ghanaian. All right, so Peter is not a Ghanaian. Therefore, Peter is not an African. Can we say that because Peter is not a Ghanaian, Peter cannot be an African? Is it possible that because Peter is not a Ghanaian, Peter can never be an African? Is it possible? So it is possible, but it is not guaranteed. The fact that Peter is not a Ghanaian doesn't mean Peter cannot be an African. Peter could be a Cameroonian or a Togolese or a South African or a Kenyan. So the fact that Peter is not a Ghanaian is not enough reason to conclude that he is not an African. So that is why an argument that denies the antecedent cannot give you a valid conclusion, because the argument is not enough, or we say the argument is not strong enough. You cannot make a strong argument, or you cannot make a strong enough argument by denying the antecedent. Now let's look at the technicality. The consequent is always a larger class of denotations or members compared to the antecedent. Now, consequent contains the denotations of both the antecedent and possibly more. So the consequent Africans contains more members than the antecedent Ghanaians. When you deny something of membership in the smaller class, you have not denied it of membership in a larger class, because there are more people in the larger class than in the smaller class. Or you say there are more items in a larger class than in a smaller class. So because something is not in a smaller class, doesn't mean it cannot be in the larger class. But when you deny something of membership in the larger class, containing all the members of a smaller class, you have automatically denied it of membership in the smaller class. So if everything in a smaller class is also in a larger class, and you're able to show that something is not in the larger class, automatically you've shown is not in the smaller class. So that's the reverse. That's the reverse. That's why we say that denying the consequent will lead you to a valid conclusion. If you're able to show that something is not a member of the consequent, then automatically you've shown is not a member of the antecedent, because everything in the antecedent is in the consequent. The consequent contains the antecedent, everything in the antecedent, and then possibly more. Now let's look at 4 kinds of deductive arguments. And these 4 kinds will show us very clearly the reason why you cannot reach a valid conclusion by denying the antecedent or by affirming the consequent. 4 kinds of deductive arguments. First of all, you have modus ponens. Modus ponens is an argument that affirms the antecedent. So all A's are B's, or if something is an A, then it is a B. X is an A, therefore X is a B. So this is an argument that affirms the antecedent. We call it a modus ponens. All Ghanaians are Africans, Peter is an African, therefore Peter is an African. It's a modus ponens, and we categorize it as a valid argument. Now let's look at the fallacy of denying the antecedent. The fallacy of denying the antecedent. All A's are B's. X is not an A, therefore X is not a B. All Ghanaians are Africans. Peter is not a Ghanaian, therefore Peter is not an African. It's not a valid argument. Peter could possibly be a Cameroonian. Now, so this is a fallacy of denying the antecedent. Now let's look at these two boxes. We have a bigger box and a smaller box. The bigger box is the box of consequence. The smaller box is that of antecedent. You can see that the antecedent is completely in the consequent. The box containing the antecedents is completely in the box containing the consequence. So everything in the antecedent is in the consequent. Everything in the antecedent is in the consequent. Give me a minute. Hello, Frida. Okay, so I just received a call. So we have the consequent box, the antecedent box. Everything in the antecedent is in the consequent, but not everything in the consequent is in the antecedent. If you say that something is part of the antecedent, then automatically you can say it is part of the consequent. So that's why we say that affirming the antecedent will lead you to a valid conclusion. If you affirm that something is part of the antecedent, then you can conclude that it's also part of the consequent. So that's a valid argument. Affirming the antecedent is a valid argument. If you deny that something is part of the antecedent, you cannot automatically deny that it is part of the consequent. That is the fallacy of denying the antecedent in order to reach a conclusion about the consequent. And then, if you say that something is part of the consequent, you cannot automatically conclude that it's part of the antecedent because it could be in a part of the consequent outside the antecedent. So you cannot reach a valid conclusion by affirming the consequent. And if you say that something is not anywhere in the antecedent, if you say that something is not anywhere in the consequent, then it cannot be in the antecedent. Denying something of membership in the consequent is to automatically deny it of membership in the antecedent. That's why denying the consequent will lead you to a valid conclusion about the antecedent. So these are the 4 ways, and you can see that from the 4 ways, only 2 of them can lead you to a valid conclusion. Now let's look at the bigger box containing Africans and the smaller box containing Ghanaians. If you say that someone is a Ghanaian, automatically you can conclude that he is also an African. If you say, and that's why we say that affirming the antecedent will lead you to a valid conclusion. If you say that someone is not a Ghanaian, you cannot automatically conclude he's not an African. That's the fallacy of denying the antecedent in order to reach a conclusion about the consequent. And then if you say that someone is an African, you cannot automatically conclude he's a Ghanaian. That's the fallacy of affirming the consequent in order to reach a conclusion about the antecedent. And then if you say that someone is not an African, then automatically the person cannot be a Ghanaian. And that's why denying the consequent will lead you to a valid conclusion about the antecedent. Okay, so we've seen why only 2 of the 4 ways can lead you to a valid conclusion. Now let's look at the third, or rather, let's look at what we call the modus tollens. All A are B, X is not a B, therefore X is not an A. Now this is an argument that denies the consequent. And we had said that denying the consequent will lead you to a valid conclusion about the antecedent. If A, then B, not B, therefore not A. Now let's look at the words. All Ghanaians are Africans. Michael is not an African, therefore Michael is not a Ghanaian. Or if Michael is a Ghanaian, then he's an African. Michael is not an African, therefore Michael is not a Ghanaian. So we had said that this is valid because if Michael is not an African, then he is not a Ghanaian. It's automatic. So denying the consequent will lead you to a valid conclusion about the antecedent. Let's look at the department and the university. Now, let's assume that some people are making this argument. All those studying in the Department of Physics are enrolled at the University of Ghana. Kelvin is not enrolled at the University of Ghana. So Kelvin is not studying in the Department of Physics. Now, let me try to put this in a more common form. Let us assume that there is a debate in the department about whether Kelvin is in the Department of Physics or not. Some people are saying Kelvin is in the Department of Physics. Some other people are saying, no, Kelvin is not in the Department of Physics. He's in some other department. So we then decide to consult the registry to find out whether Kelvin is in the Department of Physics or not. And then the registrar tells us that Kelvin is not even in the University of Ghana. So what becomes of the argument? The argument is automatically ended because if Kelvin is not in the University of Ghana, then there's no way he can be in the Department of Physics. So when you deny something of a larger class, or if you deny something of membership in a larger class that contains all the members of a smaller class, then automatically you've denied it of membership of the smaller class. So these are the 2 boxes. You have University of Ghana, you have Department of Physics. You can see that the Department of Physics is in the University of Ghana. So if someone belongs to Department of Physics, the person is in the University of Ghana. If someone is not in the Department of Physics, he could still be in the University of Ghana. You can't conclude he's not in the University of Ghana. And then if someone is in the University of Ghana, you can't conclude he's in the Department of Physics because he could be in some other department. So saying that someone is in the University of Ghana does not automatically lead you to conclude he's in the Department of Physics. But denying that someone is in the Department of Ghana automatically denies a person of being in the Department of Physics. So the fallacy of affirming the consequent is that all A are B, X is a B, X is an A. So that affirms the consequent. If A, then B, B therefore A. We said this is a fallacy. By saying that X is a B, you are not really sure if it is an A because B is larger than A. All Ghanaians are Africans. George is an African, therefore George is a Ghanaian. So the argument is not valid. So the consequent Africans contains a larger, logically larger category of denotations than the antecedent. Hello? People are not getting in. Yeah, but okay. Then I'll check if it's public. Right. Okay, so there are complaints that certain people are not able to get into the meeting, but I'm seeing 134 people here. Now, if you could give me a minute, I'll check if the team is public. Now, edit team, is it public? Yeah, it's public. So anyone who is not public means that anyone can join. That's right. So those who can join, you have to watch videos. All right, so someone is raising his hand. Is that Dos Mill? Okay, so let me enable your microphones so that you can ask your question. But the hand is down again. So let me disable your mics again. Okay, so if we affirm the consequent, we're not sure we can affirm the antecedent. In short, if we affirm the consequent, it will land us in the same kind of uncertainty that we saw in the fallacy of denying the antecedent. Okay, so now let's look at another form of the fallacy of affirming the consequent. Now, we already know by now that affirming the consequent is a fallacy. It's not valid. Now, there's another form of that fallacy which may not even make us suspect it's a fallacy, but we need to get educated now that it's a fallacy. Now let's look at another form of the fallacy of affirming the consequent. All A are not B. X is not a B. Therefore, X is an A. All A are not B. X is not a B. When you check this argument, it is an argument that affirms the consequent. Remember that in mathematics, two negatives will give you a positive. So if premise 1 is negative, premise 2 is negative, then the two of them will give you a positive. So if you are saying all A are not B and X is not a B, the second premise is actually affirming the first premise. So this is another form of affirming the consequent. It affirms it doesn't deny the consequent, it affirms it. You need to recognize that this is a case of affirming the consequent, not denying it. Okay. So let's look at words. All human beings are not good. X is not a good, therefore X is a human being. All human beings are not good. X is not a good, therefore X is a human being. Now, this is an argument that affirms the consequent. It doesn't deny the consequent because there are negatives in the two premises, and two negatives gives you a positive. Now, why is it a fallacy? You can also find out why it's a fallacy by actually looking at the contents of the argument. Now, if you say all human beings are not goods, which is true, all human beings are not goods, and then X is not a good, therefore X is a human being. Can you conclude that X is a human being just because X is not a good? Is not being a good the only condition for being a human being? If something is a good, if something is not a good, then it could be another animal. It could be a dog, a snake, a tiger, or something else. So the fact that something is not a good it is not enough to conclude that it must be a human being. So you cannot show that something is a human being by simply proving that it's not a goat. Okay. So not being a goat is a logically larger category than all human beings. So the fact that X is not a goat doesn't necessarily make X a human being. X could as well be a cat, a giraffe, or a tiger. Yeah, Joe, I'll call you back. Yeah, I'll call you back. Yes, sir. Now we've seen modus ponens, modus tollens, and we've also seen the fallacy of denying the antecedent and also the fallacy of affirming the consequent. Now, modus ponens and modus tollens are two valid types of deductive reasoning. Two valid types of deductive reasoning. The third one is hypothetical syllogism. Hypothetical syllogism. Now, you can see that modus ponens has its fallacy, modus tollens has its fallacy. Now, hypothetical syllogism also has its fallacy. In fact, hypothetical syllogism has two fallacies. But before then, let's look at what it is. An argument, now, hypothetical syllogism is an argument where the consequent of an initial or first premise becomes the antecedent of a second or subsequent premise. And the subsequent premises feature the consequence of their predecessors as their antecedent. So the conclusion pairs the very first antecedent and the very last consequent. Now, the consequent of a statement, becomes the antecedent of the next statement. So it's like saying that the ending of a statement becomes the beginning of another. And that's how you have a series of statements where the consequent of each becomes the antecedent of the next one. Now let's look at it. And then the conclusion brings together the very first antecedent and the very last consequent. Now look at this. All A are B, all B are C, therefore all A are C. Now you could see that the consequent of the first premise becomes the antecedent of the second one. And then the conclusion brings together the very first antecedent and the very last consequent. All A are C. Now all A are B, all B are C, you could extend it all the way to Z. All A are B, all B are C, all C are D, all D are E, all E are F, all F are G, all G are H, down to Z. And then the conclusion will be all A are Z. So that's why I would say it's an argument where the consequent of a statement becomes the antecedent of the next. And then the conclusion brings together or pairs the very first antecedent and the very last consequent. All Ghanaians are Africans. All Africans are human beings. Therefore, all Ghanaians are human beings. You can also extend it a bit further. All Ghanaians are Africans. All Africans are human beings. All human beings will go to heaven. Therefore, all Ghanaians will go to heaven. So that's the structure of a hypothetical syllogism. Now let me go back and see. Now, why is it called a hypothetical syllogism? Hypothetical syllogism. It's called a hypothetical syllogism because all the premises can be converted to conditionals. All the premises can be converted to conditionals. If you're a Ghanaian, then you're an African. If you're an African, then you're a human being. If you're a human being, then you go to heaven. all the premises can be converted to conditionals. But in modus ponens and modus tollens, and even in their fallacies, it's not all the premises that you can convert to conditionals. It's only the first one that you can convert to conditionals. The second one, you can't convert it to conditional. It's only in hypothetical syllogism that you can convert all the premises to conditional. So I will give you that homework. Go and look at modus ponens and modus tollens and their fallacies. Ask yourself if you can convert the second premise to a conditional. You will find out that you cannot. It's only in hypothetical syllogism that you can convert all the premises to conditional statements. Now we notice in a hypothetical syllogism, or the consequent of the first premise, which is B, becomes the antecedent of the second premise. And then the antecedent of the second premise, which is the consequent of the first premise, leads us to a new party, which is C, as the consequent. Any additional subsequent premise will typically feature the consequent of its predecessor as its antecedent, so that it is linked conditionally to a fresh party. Now let's look at two fallacies of hypothetical syllogism. There are two fallacies. The first fallacy: all A are B, all B are C, therefore all C are A. All C are A. Instead of saying all A are C, you say all C are A. That's a fallacy. The conditional version: if A then B, if B then C, therefore if C then A. Now why is it a fallacy? Let's put it in words to understand why. All Ghanaians are Africans, all Africans are human beings, therefore all human beings are Ghanaians. That's why it's a fallacy. All human beings cannot be Ghanaians. So you are not free to say all C are A. You're only free to say all A are C. If you're a Ghanaian, then you're an African. If you're an African, then you're a human being. Therefore, if you're a human being, then you're a Ghanaian. So that's not valid. Second hypothetical fallacy, the second fallacy: all A are C, all B are C. So automatically it disrupts the consequent, becoming antecedent. All A are C, all B are C, therefore all A are B. Now let's put it in words. All Ghanaians are Africans, all Kenyans are Africans, therefore all Ghanaians are Kenyans. So you can immediately see why it is fallacious. Now, in certain cases, it could give you the right conclusion. But whenever it gives you the right conclusion, that conclusion is right by accident. Right by accident. Let's see an example. Now, it can be true by accident. Ghanaians are human beings, yes. All Africans are human beings, yes. Therefore, all Ghanaians are African, which is right. Now, all Ghanaians are Africans is right, but it is not right because of the structure of the argument. It is right by accident. If you substitute it with all Ghanaians are Africans, all Kenyans are Africans, therefore all Ghanaians are Kenyans, then it becomes wrong. So whenever it's right, it is right only by accident. It's not right because it is a valid argument. The argument is invalid. Disjunctive syllogism. So this is the fourth type of deductive reasoning. We've seen modus ponens, we've seen modus tollens, the two of them are valid. We've seen hypothetical syllogism, which is valid. Now we are looking at disjunctive syllogism, which is the last kind or sort of deductive reasoning. Disjunctive syllogism is a syllogism where the main premise is a disjunctive, an either or statement. when we affirm something of any of the disjunctive items, then we have automatically denied it the other disjunctive part. Now, this disjunctive syllogism begins with a disjunctive statement, either this or this, either this or this. So subsequent statements have to choose between them. If you choose this, then you reject that. If you choose that one, then you reject this. Example, either A is true or B is true. A is true, so B is false. Or either A is true or B is true. B is true, so A is false. Now let's put it in words. Either I became a reverend father or I got married. I got married, so I did not become a reverend father. Or either I became a reverend father or I got married. I became a reverend father, so I did not get married. Either he died or he's alive. He's alive, therefore he did not die. Or either he died or he's alive. He died, therefore he's not alive. That's a disjunctive argument. Now a little exercise. Determine what kind of argument this is. What kind of argument is this? Anytime he goes to town, he passes by my mother's house. Anytime he goes to town, he passes by my mother's house. Today, he passed by my mother's house. So he went to town. Anytime he goes to town, he passes by my mother's house. So anytime he goes to town is the antecedent. He passes by my mother's house is the consequent. Today, he passed by my mother's house. So he went to town. What is the argument? If you want to answer, then you can raise your hand to make an attempt. So we have 139 persons. So out of this number, at least one person should be able to break down this argument to find out what sort of deductive reasoning it is. Is it a modus ponens or a modus tollens? Is it a hypothetical syllogism or is it a disjunctive syllogism? Raymond, you can let me see. I think I have to disable. Yes, I'll allow microphone so that you can now unmute yourself. Now you can unmute yourself, Raymond.
It is Modus tollens because
Modus ponens or modus tollens, or is it hypothetical or disjunctive?
Modus tollens.
Modus what?
Tollens.
Modus tollens. So why is it a modus tollens?
Please, because the statement affirms the consequence.
Does it affirm or does it deny? It affirms.
Yes, it affirms.
Yeah, so it affirms the consequence. If it affirms the consequence, is that actually a modus tollens?
Yes, please.
A modus tollens is an argument that denies the consequent. So if it affirms the consequent, then it is committing the fallacy of affirming the consequent. And if it is affirming the consequent, then the argument is not valid. An argument that affirms the consequent is not a valid argument. So let's look at the argument to see why it is not valid. Anytime he goes to town, he passes by my mother's house. So anytime he goes to town is the antecedent. He passes by my mother's house is the consequent. Today he passed by my mother's house, so he went to town. So the argument affirms the consequence to reach a valid conclusion. To reach a conclusion about the antecedent. Now, so who can explain by looking at the argument why it is not valid? Who can explain from common sense observation? From common sense observation. Now you've known it is a fallacy by simply obeying the rules for deductive reasoning. The next thing is to ask yourself, or to use your common sense to educate yourself on why it is a fallacy. Luke's hand is up. So Luke, can you unmute yourself?
So you can say it's a fallacy because he may decide to visit the house, but he will not go to town.
He can decide to visit the house.
So did you get me?
House. He can decide to visit the house or visit a house. Visit a house. Okay, so he can decide to visit a house without going to town, which is correct. So he passed by my mother's house. He passed by my mother's house, but did not go to town. So it is possible for him to pass by my mother's house without going to town. He may have passed by my mother's house to go to the next house. Okay, so he may have passed by my mother's house to step into the next house. So the fact that he passed by my mother's house doesn't mean that he went to town. Okay. So that's why it's not a valid argument. Now, let's answer correctly. We deduce correctly when we deny the antecedent. True or false? Amos. So Amos, you have to unmute your microphone.
Hello, sir.
Yes.
So it is false.
Number one. False. We deduce correctly when we deny the antecedent. So he said it's false. We deduce correctly when we affirm the antecedent. That's number two. We deduce correctly when we affirm the antecedent.
So should I answer?
Yes, go ahead.
So it's true.
And then number three, we deduce correctly when we deny the consequent.
So it's true.
And number four, we deduce correctly when we affirm the consequent.
So it's false.
Okay. All right, so I think we have a manageable understanding of the four ways of reasoning deductively from your responses during the exercises, I think we can now go ahead and look at validity versus soundness. Validity versus soundness. Now, the four types of deductive syllogism are really four ways of making deductively valid arguments. They are four ways of making deductively valid arguments. Now, a valid argument is an argument whose premises are logically consistent with its conclusion. The premises of a valid argument necessarily imply its conclusion in the manner that it's impossible to deny the inference without running into self-contradiction. Now, so the modus ponens, modus tollens, the valid hypothetical syllogisms, and the disjunctive syllogism, you cannot deny them without running into contradiction. It's just like denying that 2 plus 2 is 4. Now, an invalid argument, so that's the meaning of a valid argument. That's why we call them valid arguments, or we say they are valid. An invalid argument is an argument whose premises do not logically imply the conclusion. So you can see that denying the antecedent does not logically imply the conclusion. And also affirming the consequent does not logically imply the conclusion. So in an invalid argument, the relationship between the premises and the conclusion is not that of logical necessity. You can proceed to the conclusion of an invalid argument without contradicting yourself. Now, we will see that very clearly in inductive reasoning. When we start to discuss the inductive reasoning, we will see that the relationship between the premises and the conclusion is not logical at all. You can go from the premises to the conclusion sometimes without even contradicting yourself, and yet the relationship is not logical. That's why we call it an inductive argument. But for deductive argument, the relationship is logical. There's nothing you can do to change. You can't really do anything about it. If it's correct, it's correct. If it's not correct, it's not correct. And then the fallacy of denying the antecedent and affirming the consequent, we call them formal fallacies. Formal fallacies. Denying the antecedent and affirming the consequent are formal fallacies. The two hypothetical fallacies are also formal fallacies. So all the fallacies you see in deductive reasoning, we call them formal fallacies. Now, an argument could be valid, but not sound. For an argument to be valid, it has to be either a modus ponens, a modus tollens, a valid hypothetical syllogism, or a disjunctive syllogism. Otherwise, it's not valid. But for an argument to be sound, all the statements in the argument must be true. Soundness requires truthfulness. If there's any statement in the argument that is not true, then it's not sound. Now, an argument could be valid but not sound. Now, premise one, all human beings are immortal. All human beings are immortal. Peter is a human being, therefore Peter is immortal. All human beings are immortal. Peter is a human being, therefore Peter is immortal. Now, the argument is valid. It's valid, but it is not sound because there is some falsehood. There's some falsehood in premise one, which crept into the conclusion. There is some falsehood in the premise one, and it crept into the conclusion. So you can see immortal in premise one. and then it went all the way to the conclusion. So the argument is valid, but not sound. So valid because it's a correct modus ponens, but it's not sound because one of the premises is not true. Other examples: all men are mammals. All mammals must get killed. Therefore, all men must get killed. So this is a valid modus ponens. It's valid, but there is a falsehood. And the falsehood comes from premise 2, because all of us must not get killed. Then we can have an invalid argument with a true conclusion. Sometimes you can see true conclusions in invalid arguments, but those conclusions are true by accident. Democracy is better than other forms of political organization. Democracy is better than other forms of political organization because citizens in a democracy are holier compared to citizens in other forms of political organization. Now, so the conclusion is the first part. Democracy is better than other forms of political organization is a conclusion, and then because citizens in democracy are holier than citizens in other forms of political organization is a premise. Now, we all accept the conclusion as true, that democracy is better than other forms of political organization. But do we accept it because we believe that citizens in a democracy are holier than citizens in other forms of political organization? No. And so this is an invalid argument, but it has a true conclusion. So we saw this before when we were looking at an invalid hypothetical syllogism that can be true by accident. And so this is invalid, but the conclusion is true. We will say the conclusion is true by accident, but that doesn't mean the argument is valid. So true conclusion alone does not make an invalid argument correct. And then valid and sound. Now, to be sound, all the premises in a valid argument must be true. All men are mortal. Peter is a man, therefore Peter is mortal. So this is valid and sound. So we have three forms. We have valid and sound, we have valid and unsound, we have invalid and unsound. Now, valid and sound, all snakes are reptiles. Cobra is a snake, therefore cobra is a reptile. It's valid and sound. Valid because it follows the correct rule for deductive reasoning. It affirms the antecedent. And it's true because all the premises are true. Valid and unsound, all snakes are reptiles. Mosquitoes are snakes, therefore mosquitoes are reptiles. So it is valid because it affirms the antecedent, but it's unsound because one of the premises is not true. Both invalid and unsound, which is a double jeopardy. All snakes are reptiles, mosquitoes are reptiles, therefore mosquitoes are snakes. Now, it's invalid because the argument affirms the consequent. So it is invalid, technically invalid, and also unsound because one of the premises is not true. So the argument is both invalid and unsound. Is an invalid but sound argument possible? No. An invalid argument is unsound, even if the premises and conclusion are all true. All Ghanaians are Africans, Kofi is an African, therefore Kofi is a Ghanaian. Now, this is an invalid argument. It affirms the consequent. So it cannot be true. Even if the conclusion is true, it is not, the argument itself is not valid. Technicality. Validity is needed for soundness, but soundness is not needed for validity. So an argument can be valid but not sound. But if an argument is sound, then it is also valid. Some arguments are valid, but not true. So soundness needs both validity and truthfulness. Now let's do a little exercise. Identify the missing premise in each of the following deductive arguments. So now we have some arguments here, and there's a missing premise in each of them. All military men play football. Bob plays football. What is the missing premise? All military men play football. Bob plays football. There's a missing premise. Is that I'm trying to pronounce his name. Is it it's Sifu? Okay, now we have Nana. So Nana, can you unmute your microphone?
Simply the missing premise is Bob is a military man.
Bob is a military man. All military men play football. Bob is a military man, therefore Bob plays football. So that's correct. All Americans are human beings. All Americans are mammals. All Americans are human beings, therefore all Americans are mammals. What's the missing premise?
All are human beings.
All Americans are human beings. All Americans are mammals. So obviously what you need to do is to look for the terms that occurred only once and bring them together in the right order. Now you can see that the term Americans have appeared twice, and Americans have appeared twice. Human beings appeared once, and mammals appeared once. So the missing premise has to do with the relationship between human beings and mammals. Either all mammals are human beings or all human beings are mammals. Which one is it? Ronnie, either Ronnie or Joseph. So Joseph's microphone is already on. So Joe, can you answer the question?
Okay, sir. So the missing premise is all human beings are mammals.
All human beings are mammals. Okay.
Yeah.
So all human beings are mammals.
Yeah.
All human beings are mammals. All Americans are human beings. So all Americans are mammals. So that's correct. That's correct. Answer correctly. Which fallacy is committed by the following? All A's are C's, all B's are C's, therefore all A's are B's. All A's are C's, all B's are C's, therefore all A's are B's. Let me see. Samuel. Okay, Samuel's hand is not up. Ronnie has not answered the question, and Raymond's hand is up again. So Raymond, what is the answer? Yeah, so Raymond, are you answering?
Yes, please. I said fancy of hypothetical syllogism.
All the
Fallacy
answers
of
down.
hypothetical syllogism.
Yes, that's a fallacy of hypothetical syllogism. It's a hypothetical fallacy. All right, so now describe the following arguments. Describe the following arguments. All Europeans are not my friends. Ben is not a European. Therefore, Ben is my friend. All Europeans are not my friends. Ben is not a European. Therefore, Ben is my friend. Or you can say, no European is my friend. Ben is not a European. Therefore, Ben is my friend. What kind of argument? Is it a modus ponens or tollens or fallacy of denying the antecedent or fallacy of affirming the consequent? Or is it a hypothetical or disjunctive syllogism? Nana or Amos?
So I think is
Okay, sir.
modern fallacy of denying the antecedent.
Denying the antecedent. So is that coming from Amos?
No, Nana.
Or coming from Nana? Okay, so Nana, you say it is denying the antecedent. And what about Amos? Is it denying the antecedent? Does it deny the antecedent? Now, the first premise is a denial. The second one is a denial. So because both of them are denials, and especially when you see the second version of the argument, no European is my friend. Ben is not a European. Therefore, Ben is my friend. And I was saying that where there are two negatives, the result is a positive. So if there is a negation in the first premise, then the negation in the second one should actually be interpreted as a positive. So you should technically say that it's an argument that affirms the antecedent. It affirms rather than denies the antecedent. So it cannot be a valid argument because affirming the antecedent is not valid. So that's the end of the class. And we hope to do inductive reasoning next week. And that is going to be another interesting class. Any questions at this point? We would want to attend to any questions that arise before we begin to upload the recording. Yes, so Nana, you have raised your hand. So unmute your microphone so that you could be heard.
It's a mistake.
Okay, and then Morris. Morris' hand is raised. So Morris, please unmute your microphone.
Sir.
Yes.
Hello, sir. Yeah. I understood everything you taught, right? And I'm asking, the question that I have is, when is the IE?
That the coordinator is going to decide that, but I think the IA is coming up technically about one or 2 weeks after your second assignment. Have you done your second assignment?
We did some discussion. That was the, I don't know if that was the assignment, second assignment.
Yeah, so if you've done 2 assignments, then you should be expecting your IA very soon, in a matter of days or probably one week. 1 week or more.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
You're welcome. So now I'm going to have to Otensi, your hand is raised. Can you unmute your microphone? Otensi.
Okay. Sir, please, I want to know where you have been posting the videos.
Your Sakai platform and then WhatsApp. The WhatsApp platform. So have you been getting it in the two? In fact, have you been checking the two platforms?
Yes, please. I've not been seeing it in the WhatsApp platform. That's what I'm asking.
Which WhatsApp group do you belong to?
Group 4.
Group 4. Group 4. But I don't handle group 4. So I handle groups 12, 13, 52, and 53. So on those 4 groups, you get your recordings.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, so if you actually belong to group 4, but you are taking lectures in this group because of certain clashes, then that's fine. If you don't get videos on your platform, then you have to find another way to get videos. Probably you could also subscribe to, you could ask the tutor of group 12 to add you to the WhatsApp platform of group 12 so that you can be getting the recordings as well. Now I have to stop the recording so that I can begin to upload